Several philosophers, notably Rini and Sinnott-Armstrong, have recently attempted to derive dramatic conclusions from evidence about framing effects. Because the evidence about framing effects is fairly easy to understand and reasonably robust, it would be nice to see whether these arguments for the dramatic conclusions really work. So let me remind you that when we were a moment ago looking at Thompson's method of trolley cases, we saw that she relies on some premises about particular moral scenarios. So there is a morally relevant difference between David, who's the driver of this trolley in very standard trolley case, and Edward, who's a surgeon. Sorry, no, it's David who's the surgeon, isn't it? So David's actually invited to cut up a healthy person and distribute their organs to save 5 patients, and Edward's the trolley driver. Now, the question, of course, is, well, how would the reader know these premises? And I pointed out Thompson doesn't seem very interested in this, but clearly there's supposed to be some kind of non-inferential justification here. There's no possibility, I think, that Thompson would offer an inference. Now, there would be, of course, some people who say, look, there are general principles and we have to infer the premises from the principles. I'm not objecting to that. I'm just saying that that's not what Thompson is doing. And it's also, as we saw, it's not what Cam would do either. So this is supposed to be a premise which is non-inferentially justified. That's to say that whatever justifies it, it's not a piece of inference. It's supposed to be somehow more basic than that. So it's a candidate, as I said before, for being a self-evident truth in Audi's sense. Now here's the interesting thing. Rini and Sinnott-Armstrong are arguing, as Sinnott-Armstrong puts it, that no moral intuitions are justified non-inferentially. Ooh, dramatic conclusion, right? So if this conclusion is right, Thompson goes. Thompson's argument cannot work. Right? And nor, of course, can many other arguments in ethics which rely on just this kind of reasoning. So this is a dramatic conclusion. And the appealing and interesting thing to me is that Sinnott-Armstrong, and you'll see as well Rini, attempt to derive this kind of a conclusion from premises just about framing effects. Now, you may not know what a framing effect is yet, but when I tell you, you'll see it's one of the simplest phenomena that there are to understand. But a bit of terminology first. Moral intuition, we have to be careful here. So previously, we used the term moral intuition to refer to an unreflective ethical judgment. And we use that term in connection with another piece of work by Sinnott-Armstrong. Gosh, this is getting complicated. Now, in this case, Sinnott-Armstrong is clearly not talking about moral intuitions in that sense that we had earlier, because Sinnott-Armstrong's target is philosophers like Thompson. But Thompson is in the business of reflection, right? I think she would be highly offended, or perhaps just find it hilarious if we said, look, your judgments are somehow unreflective. And if you've read Thompson, you've spent a long time reflecting on the different cases, and you've perhaps, thought about them and read through her paper in different orders and gone back here and checked things out there. You've done a lot of reflection. So in this context, when we're talking about moral intuitions, we're talking about something else entirely. What we're talking about are, I think, judgments that you or I or Thompson makes about scenarios or other things where there isn't some inferential justification for those judgments. It's not just that we're unaware of any inferences, it's that whatever justification there is isn't provided by inferences. They're justified. So moral intuitions are supposed to be things which are justified inferentially. So I take this to amount to saying there are no moral intuitions. Now that's just terminology. I just want to keep the terminology straight. So how does the arguments work? Well, Sinnott-Armstrong's is easier to summarise, so I'm going to present you that one and leave you to work out Rini's own argument, even if Rini's argument might even be more interesting in some ways. They, as Rini points out, are quite similar. So Armstrong says, evidence of framing effects makes it reasonable for informed moral believers to assign a large probability of error to moral intuitions in general, such as Thompson's claim that David and Edward are different, whereas Edward and Frank are not, right? Those claims are supposed to be assigned a large probability of error. And then we're supposed to apply that probability to particular moral intuitions, all of them, until we have some special reason to believe that particular moral intuition is in a different class with a smaller probability of error. So this is what Armstrong thinks we can get out of framing effects. Gosh, that's really interesting. So here's the question. Is he right? And is Rini right? Are they right to challenge the idea that there cannot be reflective judgments which are non-inferentially justified about ethical matters? Does the evidence of framing effects actually undermine the view that as things stand, philosophers' non-inferentially justified moral judgments can yield knowledge? This is our question. Now, of course, the first thing we should do is we should ask, what are framing effects? What are framing effects? And it's actually easier to show you a framing effect than to explain what they are. So here's one of my favourite framing effects. It's not a very famous one. People usually start with very famous ones, but I like this one very much. You're a subject in an experiment and you see there's a red umbrella here. I don't know if you can see that. It's quite far away actually. And what happens is the red umbrella is going to appear to you in a variety of different positions, and you've got to make a judgment which is either far or near. Is the red umbrella far from you? Press this key. Or is it near to you? Press that key. Right? It's a very simple experiment. You're going to see a sequence of pictures and you're going to go far, 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 near, near, far, far, near, near, as the umbrella moves backwards and forwards through the scene. And the researchers are then going to judge when, from your point of view, the umbrella is far versus when the umbrella is near. Now, this is a task, I take it, about the distance between an object and yourself. Right? Is the object in a position that you would regard as near to you or far from you? That's what the instructions say. So if you're a good subject, you're doing as instructed. But interestingly, what the researchers found was this. When there is a person in the scene, the distance from the person influences the judgment, not just the distance from you, even though that's irrelevant. However, you only get that effect with a person who can act, so not with an inanimate object, nor with a dummy. And importantly, you don't get the effect when there is a person there, clearly a person there, but this person is tied up, roped up, and so is not in a position to act on the object. Very curious. So it looks like your judgment about space, is the object near or far to you, is being influenced by an irrelevant factor, which is this other person's action possibilities. Ooh, interesting, right? So it's not a judgment about whether this person can act on the thing or not, but somehow that's illegitimately influencing your judgments. So this would be an example of a framing effect. That's to say, there is a task that you're performing, and there's some aspect of the way the task is being presented to you, which is extraneous to the task, but still influencing your performance, a framing effect. All right, good. So we know what framing effects are. Does the evidence of framing effects undermine the view that philosophers' non-inferentially justified moral judgments can yield knowledge? All right, well, gosh, we know what framing effects are. What's the evidence? Good question. Some of the evidence we've already seen. So I've presented you this before. This is a lovely study, very interesting one. I do encourage you to read this if you're interested, by Schwitzgebel and Cushman from 2015, where they gave both philosophers and experts a pair of moral scenarios and asked them to judge to what extent an action was permissible. And what you can see is that they found, both among the philosophers and the lay people, more or less equally, I don't think they're statistically different, that which order the moral scenarios are presented in, whether the one they called switch comes first or second, influences the proportion of people who judge the cases to be equivalent. So if you have one of them first, you're less likely to judge them equivalent than if you have the other one first. And that holds true even if you're invited to pause for reflection. And indeed, I think they required people to pause for reflection. So I think they actually introduced a delay before which people were unable to respond. So why is this relevant? Well, a framing effect is a case where some task-irrelevant aspect of the presentation of a scenario influences your performance. Now, if we're thinking about how bad a moral scenario is, that's the task here. Is something permissible or whatever? How impermissible is it? Then the order in which you're considering that scenario, you as the philosophical bystander, is clearly not something that's relevant to the task. It's not something that's morally relevant. And yet that seems to be influencing, to some degree, your judgment. That's one of the factors which might explain why you judge one way or another. Aha. So we do have here evidence of framing effects. Now, we should focus here, there's a large literature on framing effects in moral judgments generally, but not a lot of that focuses specifically on philosophers who are, I suppose, a certain kind of expert. And so you might think have, more or less susceptibility to some framing effects than others. So what I've done here and in the notes below is to focus specifically on research which considers, like Schwitzgebel and Cushman did, philosophers perhaps as well as lay people. And what we know is that philosophers are subject to order of presentation effects to roughly the extent that lay people are. That's actually been established in a later study as well that you can find in the notes. Interestingly, if you prevent philosophers with a choice between two options, and one of them involves killing one person in order to save 5, they're less likely to choose killing one person to save 5 than if you present them with 6 options, even though in both cases the option that we're looking at is whether or not they decide to kill. So adding options to a choice makes philosophers more likely to kill. Okay, I'm not sure what that says about philosophers. Doesn't seem like a good result to me, but there you go. So we're subject to a framing effect, which is there are some irrelevant options that we don't actually select but seem to influence whether or not we choose to kill. All right, and the last one I'm not going to talk about here. This is very interesting. There's a large literature on it, but it's fairly complicated. So if you've come across Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory and their particular ways of framing, which are a sort of more sophisticated version of framing in terms of losses and gains, you'll know the very famous Asian disease example, which has been adapted for philosophers. And Wiegmann and Hovarth show that philosophers are as susceptible as lay people to this kind of framing. So that's interesting. All right, but what are we to make of this? So now we've got some basic understanding, and you can look in the notes and read a bit more in some of these studies about framing effects. We've got some basic understanding of what framing effects are. What conclusions should we draw? Well, the first thing I want to note is that we get framing effects not just in the case of ethical judgments, but also in the case of spatial judgments as well. That's why I told you about that example of space earlier at the start. Now, I take it that you regularly make a bunch of spatial judgments which are non-inferentially justified, right? So you have something in your hand and you think to yourself, will I be able to put it into the rubbish bin, the trash can, or should I walk a bit towards it? So there's a spatial judgment, and it's probably one which is non-inferentially justified. You just have a look. That's how I do it anyway. Just have a look. Now, on the basis of evidence of framing effects, should we suddenly think, gosh, well, there can't be knowledge, spatial knowledge, on the basis of non-inferentially justified judgments? I don't think so. Right? I think that would be a kind of an extreme reaction to the framing results. Well, you might say, okay, but in the ethical case, the framing effects are stronger. All right, they are, but how much stronger do they have to be before I lose my confidence in them generally? Right? This is a very difficult question. I find this very difficult. Consider another case. So financial judgments. So in the case of financial judgments, personally, once I discovered the susceptibility of humans to framing effects, I changed some of my behaviours. And in particular, if I find money on the street, I don't think to myself, I'm going to leave that there because somebody who needs it more might come along and find it. Because I've come to see that that's actually equivalent to thinking a good way to help people is just to throw around some of my spare cash onto the street. Right, to throw it out onto the street. The two things are, I think, from a moral point of view, equivalent. And I learned that by learning about framing effects. So what's happened here, I think, to many people actually, we don't want to take this too far because you can end up behaving like an economist, which may not get you many friends. Sorry. Joking. You love economists too, good. You are an economist? No, okay, all right, I've got it. Look, the point here is this, that sometimes learning about framing effects can actually improve our judgments. Doesn't mean that we're never susceptible to them, but if we're on the lookout for them, then in our more reflective moments, we can actually exploit the information that we have about framing effects to make better judgments. So look, what I'm saying here is it's pretty complicated. The bare fact that there are framing effects shouldn't by itself undermine our confidence in judgments which are not based on inferential justification. Right? We may have no inferential justification for thinking that this is the right action, or that this is worth more than that, or so on, or that this is further away and that's nearer. But we nevertheless, in some cases, might be okay. We might have knowledge knowledge that we could use even in a philosophical context. So I'm not saying that there's an objection to Sinnott-Armstrong and Rini's arguments here. I'm just saying, look, it's pretty complicated and I need to understand something about what these framing effects are doing. What's their significance? What's behind them? Now let me illustrate what might help us here. So Kahneman, talking about particular cases, so this is the Schelling child tax exemption case he's talking about here, possibly the Asian disease case. He says, in these particular cases, there is no underlying preference that's masked or distorted by the frame. Our preferences are about framed problems and our moral intuitions are about descriptions, not substance. Now this of course is controversial, but I suspect that Kahneman might be right here. What the framing effects show is so dramatic, it's essentially frames all the way down. There's no point where you remove the frames and you finally get to the substance. If you remove the framing effects, you just get nothing. You just get absolutely nothing. People don't have coherent preferences about these different ways of treating tax. There's nothing behind them. It's kind of an illusion of substance. Now, if we thought the same thing about the moral case, then I think Rini's and Sinnott-Armstrong's argument or challenge would be rock solid. If framing effects showed that there was no underlying view about the different moral scenarios, about, in Thompson's case, David versus Edward, it was all a matter of framing all the way down, then I think we should say that when we have non-inferentially justified judgments about those cases, as we do in Edward and David and so on, we should just reject those. We shouldn't consider those at all. Rini, Sinnott-Armstrong, you've won. That's fantastic. The problem, of course, is that Kahneman is making this claim in a very careful way about particular cases, and it's not based just on the idea that there are framing effects. It's based on a theory about the different processes that underpin those framing effects and about the dominance of the framing effects and their interaction with other factors that could influence judgments. Ooh, tricky. We don't have, I think, comparably deep theory about framing effects for the ethical judgment, so it's hard to infer on from this. Let's look at the other side of this. Wiegemann and Hovarth, whose research on the whole is quite negative about experts, so generally speaking, in other bits of their research, they seem to be arguing quite strongly that philosophers are no better than lay people on the whole. They've generally found this. In the latest findings, they've discovered evidence that expert ethicists have a genuine advantage over lay people with respect to some well-known biases. So this might tilt us another way. It might say, look, well, it seems like philosophers might be somewhat like economists in that they just become less susceptible to various framing effects as they become more aware of them and more sensitive to them, and so the problem just goes away. Now, I don't know, is this the right way to do it? I'm not sure. So I'm not suggesting here that I've got an objection to Rini and Armstrong. I'm suggesting what I'm missing here is the details of an argument. So where are we? So I've been suggesting that we should consider the idea that no moral intuitions are justified non-inferentially. That's to say that there are none, right? There are no non-inferentially justified judgments, which are actual pieces of knowledge. But that hinges, in the case of Sinnott-Armstrong, on the idea that evidence of framing effects makes it reasonable for informed moral believers to assign a large probability of error to moral intuitions in general. And I'm not sure that we can conclude that from the framing effects. I'm not saying we can't, I'm just saying I just don't quite see it myself. Same thing with Rini. So Rini argues that the evidence of framing effects makes it impossible for us to know whether or not we've succeeded in disengaging from the personal factors and adopting an impersonal standpoint. And again, I find it hard to know whether or not the evidence of framing effects really justifies that strong conclusion. So here are, once again, Thompson's premises about particular moral scenarios. These are judgments that Thompson makes. The question is, well, how does the reader know that these are true? The reader doesn't have any inferential justification for them. So if the reader has knowledge here, any of the readers, then that's not inferentially justified knowledge. What should we say? I think one possibility is to say this. We do sometimes judge that scenarios are morally different, even when they're not. That's what framing effects give us, pretty much. I'm exaggerating slightly, but come out in the wash. For that reason, we should withhold assent from Thompson's premises. Seems a bit quick. Seems a bit quick, but you could imagine that you could develop that line of argument. Alternatively, you might say, none of the framing effects yet discovered explain why we make these particular patterns of judgment. Therefore, a non-inferentially justified judgment can be knowledge. Now again, I think that's too quick. That's too quick a defence, because we haven't really explored what the framing effects are doing here. So there are clearly two ways that you could go. I think these are both open, but my suggestion is that we should find neither of them satisfactory. So what's going on here? Why are we in this difficult situation? I think it's because we fell for something that initially seemed attractive. The initially attractive idea was that we could arrive at a bold conclusion with very little effort. The very little effort was just to review some evidence of framing effects, which are fairly easy to understand. The bold conclusion was that philosophers are not in a position in ethics to rely on judgments which are not inferentially justified. That would be an amazing conclusion. It would have dramatic consequences for Thompson and for many other philosophers, many other ethicists. The problem, I think, is that when we think about framing effects, we're thinking about a single factor which is affecting judgments, and we're thinking about that single factor in isolation. We're not working with any kind of theory about these underlying judgments. I mean, of course, Kahneman was, but then Kahneman's basic stuff isn't just about framing effects, much deeper. So we're not working with a theory about the nature of the underlying judgments. Instead, what we're doing is considering individual factors and thinking, does this influence a judgment or not? But we know that in many cases, as we've seen before, there'll be a whole variety of different factors which influence judgments, and the effect of each of those factors will be an interaction. It will depend on which other factors are present and how. So my suggestion is that to make progress here, we need to have a deeper understanding of the nature of the judgments that we are attempting to evaluate. It's not impossible that with such a deeper understanding, we will find good grounds to uphold, perhaps for different reasons, the challenge that Rini and Sinnott-Armstrong have made. It may be that philosophers are indeed quite wrong in ethics to rely on judgments which are not inferentially justified.